Imagine this: one misplaced quip, one mischievous rhyme that nicks the pride of a sovereign, and by dawn your bells are silent forever. In the bright hush of a medieval hall, laughter could be a weapon as sharp as any dagger, and the jester was often the first to feel its edge. The motley was not merely costume, it was a warning flag stitched to a target. Behind the painted grin stood a person who lived on a cliff ledge where every joke was a step, and every step might be the last. Now pull that danger into the present. When a stand-up bombs tonight, they lose applause, followers, maybe a booking. In the 15th century, a fool who bombed might lose his tongue or his head. Today's hot takes trend and vanish with the algorithm's tide. The court fool's words didn't fade. They clung to the air like smoke, drifting past goblets and iron crowns, judged by a single face whose moods were law. Picture the gap between a brick-walled comedy club and a stone-walled great hall. The same tense silence, the same hungry eyes, except here, a frown could end a life. This is the paradox we're about to enter. The fool wore a cap that served as both crown and noose. He was licensed to tease kings and needledukes, to voice truths others dared not speak. Yet that license was written on melting wax. His wit bought him proximity, and proximity was peril. Rivals sharpened rumors like knives. A ruler's grief, a bad harvest, a lost battle. Any shift in weather could turn yesterday's darling into tonight's danger. We'll uncover the craft and courage it took to dance on that wire. How timing saved lives, how costume concealed strategy, how a song might warn a prince, and how one laugh too many could summon the headsman. So let the torchlight steady. Let the hall expand around us. Bells tremble at the edge of hearing. A drumbeat of boots fades down a corridor of stone. We're stepping toward the dais now, where a small figure tilts his cap and weighs a line like a blade. The jest is ready. The court is listening, and the price of a chuckle has never been higher. Start in a room you know. Low ceiling, a brick wall, a mic that tastes of tin on the tongue, a coil of cable curling like a sleepy snake at your feet. The crowd is a jumble of denim and glass. The air is warm with fries and IPA. A red exit sign hums above the door. You clear your throat. The spotlight breathes, and a laugh skitters across the tables like a tossed coin. Hold that sound. Let it thin, stretch, cool, until the bright heat of the club draws back like a tide, and the room around you grows larger, older. The brick wall becomes courses of rough stone. The red exit sign blurs into a torch that cracks, spits, and writes smoke on the air. The smell of hops dissolves into something heavier. Roasted meat basted with fat. Bread just torn from an oven. A hint of damp wool steaming near the fire. And the clean animal tang of horses stabled beyond the gate. Beeswax drips on iron sconces. Sweet and a little bitter. The draft carries salt from cured pork, thyme from a cook's hand, and a dusty thread of straw underfoot. The hall is long and high-bellied, ribs of timber arcing overhead like a ship turned inside out. Tapestries soften the walls, wolves in stitched forests, saints with gold thread halos, yet the stone keeps its chill. The floor is strewn with rushes that crunch and whisper under leather soles. Each footfall finds a different voice. The hollow tap of a wooden clog, the whispering slide of a silk hem, the deliberate weight of a boot made for riding and for kicking open doors. Somewhere, a greyhound sighs by the hearth. Sound gathers and unspools in layers. A trumpet tests a single note and lets it hang, bright as a coin in winter sun. A page hurries, and the quick scatter of his steps makes a skittering echo along the pillared aisle. Near the far wall, goblets touch with a thin chime. A laugh releases like a bird, and then, noticing who did not join it, flutters back into the chest that dared it. When the great door rocks on its hinges, all the small noises lean toward it, curious and a little afraid. Light moves differently here. It tastes of smoke. Torches lift their shoulders and gutter, then stand up straighter, proud of their gold. Candle flames lean into every draft, bending toward breath, toward gossip, toward a passing servant's sleeve. The glow finds the nap of velvet and climbs it like a hill. It pools in the curve of a silver ewer. It steels itself on a row of spearheads and makes a brief, bright wink, as if the weapons had told a joke to one another. In corners, the light loosens. There, the stone gives back a cool that travels through shoe leather and into bones. Touch announces the hall as much as sight. The dais stair keeps its cold even near the fire. It presses through a sole and into the arch of the foot. Wool scratches where a collar meets the neck. Linen slides, clean and cool, against a sleeve. The wooden rail at the minstrel's gallery holds the oil of 100 anxious hands. And on one cap, bright motley in red and green, the little bells have their own gravity. They tug gently at the edges of the skull, remind the neck of their presence, whispering weight at every nod. Their tongues rest now, but the head remembers how a nod can summon them, how a tilt can turn silence into silver rain. Smell keeps the measures. The hearth's oak offers a steady bass note, blue smoke threading rafters. Over it comes the steadying bread, brown crust, torn open so steam blooms like breath in winter. Spice rides in from the kitchens, pepper dear as a small sin, saffron bright as a promise, a clove crushed beneath somebody's heel, so a sweetness blooms unexpectedly near the door. A wet cloak steams on a peg. A fur throws off the cold it hoarded outdoors. Somewhere near the screen's passage, a pot is lifted, and a brief storm of garlic and thyme crosses the room, chased by the quick feet that carry it. Outside, church bells stir the dusk, far first, then near, until it seems the air itself is marked and measured. Inside, a quieter bell answers. One soft ring from the cap, unmeant, the smallest confession of nerves. A squire snorts with laughter and is hushed by his elder's palm. The minstrels tune a lute, each string finding its place, tightening up to a note that feels like a straightened spine. And then the silence arrives, the medieval kind that is not absence, but arrangement, the way a flock stills when a hawk passes. It begins at the far end, a ripple of attention that closes mouths, lifts eyes, corrects postures. The day's talk folds itself away. The light seems to stand taller. Even the hound lifts its head, nostrils threading the air. The great chair on the dais is no longer empty. Here is the bridge, almost invisible as it bears your weight. The hush you know from a crowded club before a punchline, stretched and made ceremonial. The same bright edge, the same held breath. But here that breath belongs to 100 people and a crown. In the club, a bad line will cost a minute. In this hall, time moves on a stricter leash. At the foot of the dais stands the small figure in motley. The cap is a skyline of soft peaks. The bells rest, patient. In his hand, a bauble grins, wooden and painted, a tiny mirror of a face that must always be merry. The fool's palms feel the varnish, smooth and hard under the pads of his fingers. He tastes smoke and salt on the back of his tongue. He hears the stone counting his breaths. The torch is steady. The minstrels lower their hands. Somewhere behind a tapestry, a servant clears his throat and regrets it. The fool weighs the distance to the throne, the distance to the hearth, the distance to the door, not with his eyes, but with his craft, which is part geometry, part mercy, part nerve. Laughter is a road he knows, and this hall is its most dangerous turn. He tips his head. The bells consent to a single note. The chord is ready. The jest is waiting. And beneath the smoke and spice and velvet, danger breathes as softly as a cat beneath a table, unseen but always there. He remembered the sound before any face, the steady hush and shoulder of the mill race, the wheel turning like a patient planet, the stone singing a quiet circle through grain and time. He was born into that hum, a miller's son with flour on his lashes and a talent for stacking words the way his father stacked sacks, quickly, neatly, with a grin he could not help. In spring, he made frogs into dukes with a reed for a scepter. In winter, he warmed hands by telling the fire how brave it burned. The women at the ford said he had a tongue that could polish a stone, and the old men, nursing their aches, said it would get him killed if it ever polished the wrong crown. They called him Jacques, and de Fleur came later, when somebody at court decided every fool needed a name that sounded like a ribbon. Back then, he was just the boy who made the mill's cat seem philosophical and the tax collector suddenly generous for 2 days running. He learned timing from the grain chute, how to let a handful fall, then the next, then a scatter, never all at once. He learned mercy from his mother, who told him that making people laugh was a way to ease the day's wheel, not spin it faster. The Lord Steward found him by accident. In a bad year, when the river sulked and the wheel slowed, the steward had come to count flour for the tithe and had a nose like a knife and a purse like a locked mouth. Jacques saw his father's jaw tighten, saw the quick little prayers his mother tucked behind her eyes. So he gambled. He slipped between measure and measure, bowed low to the steward's shadow, and greeted the man as if he were a saint of accounts, a protector of small scales and honest weights. He praised the way the steward's quill scratched like a hawk's feather, certain to snatch every error from the page. He looked up through his lashes and mimicked the steward's cluck, just one note, perfectly cruel and perfectly fond. And the laborers snorted, then coughed, then shook like sacks of rye. The steward did not laugh, not at first. He watched, and Jacques felt the weight of being watched by someone who could rearrange a life for the cost of a signature. Then the man smiled a slim smile, put 2 coins on the millstone as if tipping a shrine, and said, "The king's court keeps a place for wit, boy. There's meat at that table." The way he said it, meat could mean mercy. The way his father's hand crushed the edge of his apron, meat could mean danger. That night, while the wheel turned in the dark, mother and father spoke low, and the sound of their speech made a different weather inside the house. "He's quick," his father said. "Quick is useful and quick is risky." His mother tied a cord around a little pouch of rosemary and salt and hung it on Jacques' neck. "Quick must learn soft," she said. "Soft keeps quick alive." The cart that took him to court smelled of ox and wet rope. Villages unspooled, each with its own bell and its own dogs and its own old man who knew the name of every cloud. Jacques told stories to the driver, not for pay, but for practice. How a goose fell in love with its reflection in a puddle and refused to migrate. How a fox put on a bishop's hat and preached against chickens pecking after dark. The driver laughed, but the road told a stricter joke. The nearer they drew to the city, the more the stone learned to make echoes, and the more Jacques heard his own voice come back to him wearing different clothes. Now, daring. Now foolish. Now oddly brave. The palace took his breath the way a cold river does when you first kneel to drink. There were courtyards where the air wore perfume like armor, galleries where every painting had eyes that knew secrets, kitchens where the noise was so busy it felt like the heartbeat of a beast. They put him in a room not far from the minstrel's gallery and farther from the stables than he would have wished. He liked the honest noise of hooves, and they gave him a cap whose bells were subtle as thin glass, and a marotte, a little carved face at the end of a stick that grinned with permanent courage. "Smile even if you cannot," said the master of revels. "Your stick will do it for you." He learned the court the way a sailor learns a coastline, every shoal by rumor, every safe inlet by experiment. There was an old fool at court called Colin of the Scarlet Hood, because his motley had faded to a certain practical red. Colin had seen 3 kings come, and one go poorly. He took a liking to Jacques for the same reason the hound liked him. The boy fed what he loved and did not step on it. Colin taught him the rule of distances. 3 measures, he said, tapping the stone with his toe. From you to the throne, that is courage. From you to the hearth, that is comfort. From you to the door, that is survival. At any moment, know which you need. Jacques practiced bowing until his spine learned to tell the truth even when his mouth could not. He practiced the difference between a barb and a brush, between a mirror that made a lord handsomer and one that showed him his stain. He practiced silence too, the sort that invites someone to step into it and claim they were always meant to be there. Often, after lessons, he would find the back stair down to the pantry and sit with Agnes of the ovens, who had wrists like strong rope and a way of laugh-sighing that made sorrow seem temporary. Agnes liked him because he didn't steal figs, and because he made the kitchen boys feel like captains when he complimented their wooden spoons as if they were scepters. His first performance was not a performance so much as an accident with witnesses. The court had gathered for a winter feast. Furs warmed backs, and wine warmed the parts fur couldn't reach. The king sat with his fingers wrapped around a goblet, like a man holding a tame hawk that might yet fly. A baron, whose mustache arrived half a day before he did, told a story about a boar he had slain, and the laughter arrived in the right places, whether the story had earned it or not. Jacques stood at the edge of torchlight, stomach humming like the mill wheel. Colin nudged him. "A small step," whispered the old man. "Just one." See where the floor holds Jacques tilted his cap, the bells agreeing, and walked into the warm. He held the marotte forward as if asking its permission. "My lord," he said to the boar killer, with a bow so honest it bordered on insolence, "I have heard of such a creature. Great tusks, great courage, and a great ability to fall upon the knife of a man who tripped at exactly the right time." The baron stiffened, wine dimming in his eyes. Jacques felt the room measure him, thread by thread. Then he smiled and let the marotte lean in, its painted lips near the baron's beard. "But perhaps I am confused. Perhaps it was the boar who told the story." The baron's jaw twitched. Someone snorted through their nose. The king's mouth put away a frown and held something that might be amusement. The floor held. Laughter found its tide mark. Later, in a smaller room where the air had less gold in it, Colin clapped Jacques on the shoulder. "You tried the throne distance too soon," he he said, not unkindly. But you remembered the door. That saved you. Jacques nodded and pretended his hands were not trembling. Agnès handed him a heel of bread with a smear of something sweet. For your wit, she said, and for your nerves. He ate and felt mortal in a good way. Days scrolled like decorated margins. Hunts and councils, baptisms and rumors. Jacques made himself useful in the in-betweens. He fetched smiles for the queen when politics took hers. He made a prince laugh by teaching the boy's hawk to pretend it was an owl by day. He listened. He learned which lord wore his guilt like a heavy ring and which wore it like perfume. He learned that the king's temper didn't explode so much as evaporate into a cold that made everyone around him put on extra layers of obedience. He learned who sharpened their envy under velvet covers and who dulled it with piety. He also learned fear in its fine clothes. It did not always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it sat beside him like a mild uncle and asked gentle questions. Do you mean that? Will you stand by it? If you are wrong, who pays? The old fool spoke plainly about consequences. There's a man with a block, Colin said, as if discussing a tradesman. He's not cruel, but he is consistent. You'll never meet him if you mind the weather. Jacques looked at the sky. He had always loved clouds. Now he studied moods. How grief tightens a crown. How coin-short winters make tempers quick. How victories make men loud and then oddly thin, like a drum skin pulled too tight. Letters came from the provinces like migrating geese. Some brought praise, some brought petitions, some brought news that sat in the mouth like iron. One autumn, news of a lost skirmish arrived with the smoke of wet leaves. A general had marched too far on a rumor and returned with fewer men, and an explanation that did not love the truth. The king listened, a stillness in him causing a stillness in others, and courtiers began to walk as if the floor might betray them. Taxes, of course taxes, were the rope they tugged to pull the kingdom back into balance. Jacques heard the word in hallways as if somebody had let a swarm of bees into the palace. It was then that he thought of the mill. He thought of his father's hands, white from flour and tight from the cord of fear, and his mother's little rosemary charm. He could imagine the steward returning with his thin smile and generous arithmetic. He could see Agnès's cousin, a cooper, watching barrel staves, and hope shrink in the cold. He held the marotte and felt the grief in its carved grin. The master of revels summoned him. Cheer, Jacques, the man said softly, which is how they ask for miracles. The king is iron today. Iron needs a little oil. Colin's eyes were kind. You know the distances, the old fool murmured. But remember, oil makes fires brighter if you pour it carelessly. That night's banquet carried a new hunger. People ate as if food could anchor them against uneasy water. The general sat a little away from the king, his jaw tight enough to crack a pip. The chancellor's smile had more teeth than usual. At Jacques' corner of the room, the candlelight shook as if it were also considering the door distance. The fool took a breath measured to the length of his cap, lifted his bells, and stepped out. Words are tools, but sometimes they arrive as animals, skittish, handsome, dangerous if cornered. Jacques let the safe ones circle him. Compliments, puns, a mimic's light toe on the surface of a lord's walk, the marotte's ridiculous wisdom. Laughter came in careful thimbles. He could feel the court waiting for the thing the master had requested, the oil. They wanted the moment to change shape. They wanted to be told, skillfully, that the day's bruise was a blush instead. He could do it. He had a pretty fable about a goose who mistook a storm for a blessing and was saved by a shepherd with a trumpet. The king would hear mercy, the general would hear courage. The courtiers would taste relief like sugar in wine. Jacques almost began it. The Marat grinned encouragement. Then he thought of the mill. He thought of the steward's fingers counting what wasn't there. He thought of men in his village who would sell their oxen, and then their roofs, and then their silence. Truth had saved him before. Truth had also been the cliff's edge. He stood on it now, and his heart, that good old mill wheel, turned and asked what kind of water he would feed it. There was a way, he told himself. Colin's way, the soft way. Not the naked blade, but the blade wrapped in cloth. He could sketch a little parable with the ink of laughter, draw a king who loved his people so fiercely he would rather bear the bruise himself than press it into their bread. He could place the general as a fox who listened to rumor birds, and the fox could confess, and the court could forgive, because the fox would have the grace to be funny. But jokes are maps, and he knew maps can betray you if the terrain refuses to cooperate. He saw, as if from above, the terraces of reaction, the king's iron, the general's pride, the chancellor's teeth, the room's appetite for a safer world. He saw his choices like doors. Behind one, flattery, easy and immediate as butter on hot bread, a sweetness that would melt and be forgotten by morning. Behind another, a dare, a slight edge, a line that tickled the truth's ribs without making it cough blood. Behind a third, silence, the hardest performance of all, in which he would make himself small as a shadow and wait for weather to change without him. He remembered the rule. From you to the throne, courage. From you to the hearth, comfort. From you to the door, survival. He could almost hear Colin's bells beyond the curtain, a private metronome. He chose a fourth thing, craft. He gave himself a breath and lent it to the Marat, as if consulting a wiser twin. My lords, he began, I was raised by a wheel that eats grain to feed people. It turns whether we sing to it or not. But sometimes, when the river sulks, the wheel turns slower, and the miller is tempted to put his hand where the grain should go. A murmur passed like a breeze ruffling records. He does not do this because he is greedy, Jacques said quickly, letting his voice put warm arms around the room. He does it because the village must eat, and because the steward counts loud enough for the saints to hear. He paused to let the laughter at that image arrive, small and grateful, saints with ledgers, tutting at the numbers. Then he bent the line, just a little. But a wise lord, he said, walks to the river with the miller and asks the river why it sulks. He does not demand more from the wheel. He calls the clouds and bargains with the sky. And if the sky refuses, he eats less meat and shares warmer bread. The silence that followed was the good kind, he prayed, the kind where people consider themselves better than they were 5 minutes ago. He kept his face mild, the cap's bells inert. The king's eyes were not iron now. They were a deeper metal, older, the color of decision. The chancellor's teeth withdrew behind a lip that had remembered how to be human. The general's jaw unclenched, then relit with something else. Not anger, but attention. He let the moment loosen. He juggled 2 apples and a pear with deliberately average skill and failed, winning a laugh that carried neither malice nor relief. He turned the Marat's silly mouth to the general and asked, in a piping falsetto, what rumor birds taste like. Like pigeons, the Marat answered in Jacques' own voice, and the general startled, then actually smiled, as if he too were tired of eating untruth. The room breathed again. After, in the seam between night and tomorrow, Jacques sat on the stair to the pantry beside Agnès. She gave him a fig this time. "For your courage," she said. "Or your caution," he answered. "Sometimes I cannot tell them apart." She leaned her shoulder against his arm and said nothing, which is the perfect joke when the day has spent all the other kinds. Colin joined them, the red hood a little darker, where wine had saluted it. "You spoke to the throne from the hearth," the old man said. "That is a good trick. Dangerous, but good. Remember that some days the hearth is cold." Jacques nodded. His laughter lines ached the way a swordsman's shoulder aches after practice. He thought of his mother's charm, and of the steward, and of the way truth, when told softly, can still echo like a bell in a tower that doesn't exist yet. He slept badly and rose early, walking the yard while the geese keys opened the dawn. A stable boy named Etienne, with hands permanently fragranced by hay, fell into step beside him. "My father lost a pig to the taxes last winter," Etienne said, as if they were discussing the weather. "Tonight you stood between my father and his next pig." Jacques felt that old mill sound in his chest, the river's patience. "I stood between no one and anything," he said carefully. "I waved my hands and told a story." Etienne shrugged. Sometimes that is the same thing. Word travels oddly in palaces. It wears good shoes. By noon, the kitchen knew something had loosened in the king's face, and by vespers, the laundresses had turned it into a romance in which a fool taught a monarch to weep. Jacques tried to keep his shoulders ordinary. When the chancellor passed him and paused, he arranged his smile for either outcome. "You understand grain," the man said, voice woolly with calculated kindness. "Mind that you do not speak of steel." Jacques bowed. "I know nothing about steel," he said, which was true in a way, and false in a way, and safe in both. Letters still came. The river still sulked sometimes. The court's hunger for easy laughter returned like a dog that pretends not to beg. But something in Jacques had shifted, not into bravery, so much as into a habit of listening for the smaller bell under the church bells. Each day, he practiced walking the 3 distances with care. He allowed himself to be loved by the hound and liked by Agnès and tolerated by the chancellor. He kept the general when they met eyes across a hall in a place of mutual recognition where jokes could shake hands with faults and not betray them. Fear did not leave. It learned his name and used it softly. He kept it the way one keeps a sharp knife wrapped in cloth, useful, a little frightening, more honest than silver. Sometimes, alone, he took off the cap and set the bells beside him on the table. Without their pull, his head felt like a boat unmoored. He would practice saying hard truths to the Marat, test their weight and polish their edges. He would imagine the mill, and then the throne, and then the door, and he would choose, and choose again, and choose again. When the master of revels next said, "Shear, Jacques," it was spring, and the kitchen smelled of young onions and lamb's hope. He stepped into the hall and thought of a wheel. But now, not the mill's wheel. He thought of the small wheel he wore on his cap, the circle of bells that rang when he moved. They were a kind of calendar, he realized, a way of measuring the season inside a room. How many times can a man tell the truth and live? As many as his bells will allow, if he learns to move kindly. He touched the Marat's carved grin, and for a moment that belonged to no king, smiled back. He could speak to power without spitting, and he could love the people who would never know his name. Between those 2 labors, a life could be made, tense, careful, useful. He would earn his de fleur, not from some courtier's pun, but because he meant to bloom quietly, even in shadow, even next to iron. And so, the fool walked out into the light again, bells steady, voice mild, heart like a good river, carrying what it must, sparing what it could, wise to the rocks, and still, somehow, singing. At court, Jacques' craft wore a strange badge, a liberty stitched from bells. People called it the fool's license, as if it were parchment signed in ink and sealed in wax. In truth, it was made of nothing steadier than a mood. It meant he could say aloud what others only breathed into goblets, so long as the sovereign found the saying useful, or diverting, or both. It was half freedom and half noose. In the legal books, a jester ranked with servants. In the daily book, he could step closer to the throne than dukes who owned a county of sheep. That closeness bruised the air around him. It made friends hard to keep and enemies easy to collect. Courtiers measured status by how near their shadow fell to the king's. A fool's shadow often touched the same floorboard, and that was intolerable. They told themselves he was only furniture with jokes, then flinched when furniture spoke. Many treated Jacques as a convenience, a dispenser of jests and little humiliations to be ordered up like spiced wine. The more clever among them treated him as a danger. They saw that laughter was a kind of lever. With it, a man could lift a subject everyone pretended was too heavy to move. They also saw that levers, mishandled, crush fingers. From the kitchens to the Privy Council, people sorted themselves into those who used him, those who feared him, and those who tried not to be seen with him when the weather of power turned rough. The chancellor bowed just enough and never more, as if acknowledging a tool that might one day be needed, and that must be kept oiled and far from the nursery. The Queen's ladies passed kindness across the line like bread under a table, a mended glove, a tapestry place that caught warmth. The young men with swords made a sport of testing their skins against his barbs, laughing loud when he scratched them, and louder when he did not. He was a mirror they wanted to control. Tilt it down, and it showed only their shoes. Tilt it up, and it showed weather they preferred to ignore. Down in the city, and out in the villages, his image blurred into older customs. Peasants knew traveling players and mummers, and the rough misrule of feast days when the world turned upside down. They had seen masked men mock the priest at the Feast of Fools, had banged pans in Charivari when a neighbor married poorly, had laughed at a pig wearing a cap and called it my lord. They knew the utility of mockery. It kept pride from swelling into cruelty too fast. But a permanent, palace-paid fool seemed to them an odd creature, neither free like the Skomarok who could shoulder his drum and leave, nor holy like the ragged, blessed ones who spoke God's riddles in the square. When Jacques rode home through the mill hamlet that first spring, children stared as if a carnival had broken loose from its calendar. Old men nodded once and thought of weather and taxes. Some women crossed themselves, then pretended they hadn't. He works for their laughter, someone said at the bake oven, and no one cared to untangle whether envy or pity moved the words. The crown's culture prized shows that braided beauty and dominance. On feast days, the great hall became a theater. Heralds choreographed entrances. Masks turned politics into allegory in velvet. Tourneys hammered the lesson that strength deserved silk afterward. The court's appetite for spectacle ran in a narrow channel between grace and harm. Bear baiting and cockfights drew cheers not far from where lutes spun gentler nets. Executions gathered crowds as reliably as tournaments, and if the gallows stood just beyond the palace gate, it might as well have been erected in the mind of the hall. Cruelty was not a secret. It was a public grammar, and every official learned to conjugate it. I punish, you obey. He entertains, we are safe. In such a grammar, laughter belonged to power. It was a bell to ring when the king wished the room to change temperature. When the monarch laughed, laughter rippled outward in correct proportions. A duke laughed second, a baron third, the butler when the sound reached the buttery. When the monarch did not laugh, the room collapsed its mirth like a tent. Jacques' specialty was managing that weather, loaning the king laughter when the king wanted to be seen as human, catching it and hiding it when the king wanted to be seen as iron. The risk could not be insured. A jest that yesterday skimmed the surface, like a swallow, might today hit a hidden current and drown. That is why the old fool's rule about distances mattered. From you to the throne is courage, Colin had said. From you to the hearth is comfort. From you to the door is survival. Socially, too, the distances mapped a life. By the hearth, the kitchens, the scullery, the stables, Jacques was kin. He learned the names of dogs and of pots that behaved like dogs, stubborn and loyal. He slipped the kitchen boys the compliment that made them square their shoulders. He deflected a steward's meanness with a joke that looked harmless from above and felt like rescue from below. There his bells weighed like ordinary tools. Near the throne, the bells became a crown nobody else would choose. There he was not quite a person. He was permission, temporarily embodied. Half freedom is a strange diet. It makes a man careful with appetite. Jacques learned to chew on silence when silence offered more life than a witty answer. He learned to drink slowly from praise because praise is often laced with use. He learned to eat his own pride the way a soldier eats hard bread, not because it is delicious, but because it keeps him moving. Most courtiers disliked him on principle, and on that principle they built a city of small exclusions. Invitations arrived that did not include his name. Favors were paid in rooms where he was briefly inconvenient. Blame looked for him first, when blame needed a quick bed for the night. He, in turn, built his own maps of approach and avoidance. He walked corridors at odd hours to avoid the young blades who wanted sport. He made the laundresses laugh, because clean linen is a power in any palace, and because laughter, once shared, is a sort of witness. He allowed certain lords to think they had taught him a trick. They would guard the trick as if it were a joint investment. And he watched the king, because the king's face was the weather page on which all other pages took their cue. The king's favor did not prevent danger. It merely rescheduled it. Everyone knew stories. In England, the name that rose to a listener's lips was Will Sommers, Henry VIII's fool, painted in velvet, and bells not far from where queens came and went like seasons. Chroniclers and later tellers liked to show Sommers as a small, bright human hinge in a door that swung on iron policy. Anecdote made him bold by inches, touching a nerve and living, crossing a line and being pulled back because the hand that could have pushed him over preferred the jolt of truth to the pleasure of punishment. The tale that drifted to Jacques through visiting merchants said that Sommers once pleaded for a princess the king had set aside, or for a queen the king had tired of, and that he managed it wrapped in comedy, as if cushioning a blade in silk. Whether the details were tidy truth or seasoning didn't much matter. The function of the story was precise. It was a parable about the fool's double soul. Tenderness housed in jest, and the perpetual risk of being tender publicly. Across the channel, at the French court, a name with a ring like a tossed coin, Triboulet. In the popular telling, he earned the king's wrath more than once, and the king's laughter often enough to balance the ledger, until it didn't. One version said he was condemned, and granted the courtesy of choosing his manner of death, chose of old age, a cleverness that bought him banishment instead of a blade. Another legend had him striking the king playfully and being told he could redeem himself by insulting someone of higher station. He promptly slapped a duke. The stories contradict themselves like drunk uncles at a wedding, but all agree on the center: privilege that evaporates like dew when the sun of power moves half a degree. Far to the east, in the Russian lands, fool carried a darker, stranger perfume. The Eurodivi, the holy fools, were not court jesters at all, but they worked the same border with death. They howled riddles at princes, wore chains in summer, and went barefoot in snow, and told truths that polite men kept folded in their sleeves. One, remembered as Basil the Blessed, reproached Ivan IV so nakedly that the Tsar, who knew how to be terrible, allowed himself to be rebuked. The idea that a fool could shame a ruler before God dug deep into the soil of that culture. It was a different license, anchored in heaven rather than in theater. But the risk was the same: protection that seemed absolute until it wasn't. Many holy fools died under hands that could not bear their clarity. Jacques, hearing such tales at the edge of the fire one winter, understood that his bell-stitched liberty had cousins in other languages, and that every cousin had a graveyard. Within the court's own norms, cruelty often wore the same ribbon as comedy. A man tripped, and the room laughed. A lesser man flogged in the yard drew spectators up to windows. Pranks could be engineered into punishments, and punishments into pranks. A favorite might order a fool to duel with pastry swords before a crowd that had watched real steel bite flesh that morning. The spectacle did not pretend to lack teeth. It simply smiled while showing them. Jacques' task was not to abolish that appetite. He could not. His task was to turn it aside an inch when it would have shredded someone who did not deserve shredding, and to feed it a safer sweetness when it threatened to bite the wrong neck. He understood, too, how laughter policed the powerful. A misstep by a lord could be forgiven if it raised a grin. A pattern of missteps could be managed by joking first, before enemies could declare it crime. The chancellor once helped himself to a levy meant for road repair, and then produced, at dinner, a little speech about the road of loyalty being the only highway worth paving. Jacques waited a week, and then, in a mask, played a man whose pockets were roads that swallowed every coin. They were potholes, he explained, so deep they reached the infernal mint, where Satan paid interest. The court snorted. The chancellor smirked. The roads were not better the next year, but the chancellor turned generous at the hospital, where nobles saw and told each other about their own mercy. Laughter had not reformed a soul, but it had moved a hand to a purse. Jacques counted that a kind of victory. His half-freedom required the kind of obedience men write badly about in poems because they dislike admitting it exists. He obeyed his own sense of proportion. He obeyed weather. He obeyed the unspoken rule that grief makes jokes expensive. When a little prince died of a fever that had no name, Jacques stayed away from the hall and sat in the chapel's shadow seat, polishing his bells with a cloth. When the queen returned, her face a winter field, he offered no speech. He placed the marat on the flagstones as one might lay a flower. A week later, When the first small laugh returned to the household, unrelated to him, a kitchen boy's accidental triumph over a tray, then he let a line about spring share the air. He understood that power demands witness in sorrow as in joy. His risk was misunderstanding the size of the witness required. From the villager's point of view, his life looked both enviable and profane. He wore color. He ate white bread. He knew the tastes of sauces that most men would never smell. But he also wore a cap that declared he belonged to nobody and to everybody. A cap that made their children brave enough to tease him. In harvest season, when he traveled to mock the Lord at the manorial court in the customary play, he found eyes that shone at the license and then clouded at the memory that he lived by it all year. They could not trust a man who laughed for a living. They could not forgive that he might laugh for the king. Jacques kept a small ledger in his head, the way a miller does, of debts owed and paid, of balances struck. He paid for the king's smiles with sleeplessness, with the knowledge that a misread face might end him. He paid for the kitchen's love with discretion. He carried their secrets as carefully as he carried the queen's. He paid for the privilege of truth with the constant possibility that truth would be declared a breach of contract and that the contract would be found to have been one-sided all along. Men who study such things, priests with tidy notes and lawyers with tidy beards, like to say that the fool serves as the body politic's conscience, speaking the unspeakable in a form that can be heard without blood. This is almost true, which is sometimes worse than a lie. The fool also serves as the body politic's scapegoat, the lightning rod for angers that cannot be safely pointed upward. If a war goes badly, a lord may strike the jester and feel briefly as if he has struck fate. If a tax bites too deep, a magistrate may demand a sharper jest at market day, and the people will feel, for a moment only, that justice has acknowledged them. Jacques knew he was both mirror and sponge. He could reflect a shape back to its maker. He could also soak up pain that had elsewhere no proper cloth. The court's norms pretended to be permanent as stone, but they shifted like rushes on the floor, replaced and rearranged with the seasons. During Carnival, misrule ascended the dais. Bishops of fools gave mock blessings. Kings endured little pelting truths as if the pelting had been pre-approved. At midnight, the pageant folded. The broom came. The world returned to its usual cruelty. The lesson was not subtle. License was seasonal. You could kiss it on the mouth for a day, and the next day it would slap yours. The wise learned to take their joy in increments and to hide it under their tongue like a communion they did not intend to spit out. If Jacques sometimes envied the blunt power he polished with his jokes, he seldom let the envy harden. He grew attached to the people on the edges who taught him where his bell-born liberty mattered. A midwife who joked with him under the castle stairs and asked him, gently, to make the Lord laugh before rent day. A soldier whose knee ticked in rain, who confessed that a jest about the king's own limp had allowed him to feel, for one evening, that he could live with his wound. A clerk who, hearing Jacques mimic the chancellor's Latin, dared to write a petition in his own hand and got an answer because the court had laughed at that Latin and could not pretend it had been music. These were small economies, not the headline gifts of kings. They were enough. He knew, of course, that history would remember fools the way history remembers weather, as background to more serious storms. A few names would ring like bells: Sommers in England, Triboulet in France, the holy ones in Russia whose dirt-poor courage frightened czars. The rest would be swallowed by the rushes and the smoke. That was not a tragedy, he thought, so long as the people who had laughed and then lived a little easier kept the memory, the way hands keep the shape of tools they've used well. He was content to be a handle for something larger than his own fame, provided the handle did not snap. Half-freedom kept him from romanticizing his role and kept others from romanticizing it for him. He was no saint. He had ducked when he might have stood. He had trimmed a truth to fit a safer night. He had flattered a danger into forgetting his knife. He had also, on some evenings, made a room remember that it could be kinder than its habits. In a culture where cruelty and delight sat at the same table and shared the same plate, that was a service, the kind that never made it into poems, but that might, in a kitchen after midnight, earn him a second bowl of soup and a glance that said, wordlessly, "We saw what you did, and we are still here." If the courtiers resented him for proximity, if the villagers doubted him for profession, if the law defined him as ornament, he still held a small, stubborn claim. He could walk the three distances, and sometimes the walking changed the room. He could stand close enough to the throne for a joke to save face without sparing guilt, then carry that softened face back to the hearth where a girl in flower would sleep easier. He could move the weather by an inch, and an inch, in a hard climate, is the difference between harvest and hunger, between a man being beaten and a man being sent away with bluster. That is what the license of folly is, after all. Not safety, not status, not a spell that makes kings humane. It is a narrow path laid over a chasm, renewed with each step, vanishing behind you as you walk. Jacques learned to place his feet with care. He learned to keep one ear on the laugh and the other on the silence beneath it. And in a court where laughter was a tool of rule and cruelty a public entertainment, he learned that gentleness could pass for wit if delivered with bells, and that sometimes wit could pass for gentleness long enough to keep someone alive. Pull the view back from the warm circle of torchlight where Jacques works until the hall becomes a miniature on a table map, and the table becomes a kingdom, and the kingdom a set of neighboring weathers. From this height, the fool's cap is less a costume than a symbol on a chart, a little bell that marks where truth can be spoken without immediately calling down thunder, and where, just as quickly, thunder can decide to arrive anyway. Politics first. Courts were not merely places where laws were written. They were theaters where power learned how it wished to be seen. The fool stood near the stage manager's rope. He did not write decrees, but he could tug at the curtain. A clever jester learned to make a joke into a memo the king could hear in public without losing face. If the king was rash, the jest cautioned him while praising his daring. If the king was vain, the jest flattered him into noticing a fault. If a minister grew too fat on the granary, the jest made the room aware of the bulge before rebellion did. In a world where messengers could be punished for the news they carried, jesters designed messages that could survive delivery. This function rested on two devices: proximity and plausible deniability. Proximity placed the fool within earshot of decision. He could whisper to the monarch in the form of shared laughter, which is one of the few languages rulers cannot receive from a distance. Plausible deniability clothed that whisper. "It is only a jest," the formula ran, an elastic phrase that let a listener assent without confessing and reject without punishing, until a day came when the listener did punish, and then the phrase shrank to a poor fit. Consider the way a jest travels across a hall. A fable about a mill that eats too much grain is not a tax policy, but it's an argument about who should tighten which belt. A mimicry of a swaggering general is not a court-martial, but it's a suggestion that the crown noticed and prefers a different gait. Laughter, multiplied by witnesses, can be memorized by a council without minutes. In this sense, fools served as feedback loops in fragile systems, early warning devices for storms of pride, little valves that let out pressure before a boiler cracked. Because the loop ran through human appetite, it was never safe. Chroniclers and later tellers preserved names as parables. In England, Will Sommers survives in paint and anecdote beside Henry VIII, a small, frank face within a world of velvet and appetite. Whether he truly interceded for a disgraced princess or merely teased a tyrant back from a tantrum, the stories insist that a line delivered with bell-born license could nudge iron policy by an inch. An inch, in palace geometry, is sometimes the difference between a living neck and a historical morale. In France, Triboulet's legends contradict each other the way fireside tales often do, but they agree on the structure. The king's laughter made a fool invulnerable, until the king's anger erased the magic word. In one telling, condemned and allowed to choose his death, Triboulet chose old age, and the king, pleased by the cleverness, converted execution to exile. The lesson travels more cleanly than the facts. Wit could buy time, time could buy mercy, and both were rented, not owned. In Muscovy and beyond, the holy fools, the Eurodivy, stood farther from velvet but closer to thunder. They shamed princes with God's riddles, and their protection flowed from heaven's scandal rather than from court's fashion. The stories say that some czars tolerated this rebuke as proof of their piety. Others silenced it as proof of their power. The role was political, even when it insisted it was not, because in any system, the person licensed to speak without ordinary consequence becomes a measure of how consequence is allotted. All of these examples reveal a truth that makes modern ears flinch. The fool's freedom was not a right, it was a favor. That is why it worked and why it failed. A favor can be revoked by mood, by grief, by rumor, by a well-placed whisper. The fool walked the length of that revocability every day. His craft was to make the truth taste like something the listener already liked. His danger was discovering too late that the listener preferred a different dish. This brings us to the broader weather, the medieval limits of speech. Before printing multiplied dissent faster than censors could count, words moved by voice, song, sermon, proclamation, rumor. The law knew how to punish seditious speech, lewd lampoons, libel that shaved a noble's honor. The church knew how to name heresy and how to scorch it out of the throat. Village custom knew how to make ridicule into discipline. Charivari that banged pots beneath the window of a man who married too soon after his wife's death. The feast of fools that crowned a mock bishop to invert order for a day and thereby, paradoxically, confirm it for the rest of the year. In that landscape, the fool was both exception and example. Exception, because he could say what others could not. Example, because his treatment taught everyone else the price of saying it. If he flourished, people might believe the ruler could bear correction. If he fell, people learned to file their tongues to safer shapes. The space around the jester, variable, precarious, was the visible frontier of tolerance. It advanced or retreated with war, with plague, with the quality of a monarch's sleep. One might imagine a straight line from that frontier to what modern people call free speech. but the line bends and doubles back. Medieval laughter did not emancipate the tongue. It managed it. Power made room for controlled transgression, because controlled transgression reassured power that it was still in control. Carnival let the town shout down the mayor one day a year, so the mayor could work undisturbed the other 364. The fool's cap worked like carnival in miniature. Contained misrule wrapped around the head of someone who could be rewarded, ignored, or broken without rewriting the law. It is sobering and clarifying to see how much safety love of wit can create, and how quickly it disappears when love of order is pricked. Yet the jester's work also planted seeds. Every time a king let the room laugh at a truth, he admitted, if only to himself, that truth can be heard without the sky falling. Every time a council endured a mimicry of its pomp, it practiced the muscle that keeps grievance from growing teeth. The fool helped rulers exercise the part of governance that listens. He shaped political culture, that unscribed constitution of gesture and expectation by which even autocrats must sometimes live. The larger processes that thread beneath the bells are not only about speech, they're about how societies metabolize pain and pride. In hard years, jokes reach for safety. In triumphant years, jokes reach for humility. Where cruelty is public theater, humor can become triage, redirected like a stream toward the least damaging bank. Where cruelty is private policy, humor becomes a flashlight under a door. The medieval court displayed its cruelty openly. The fool diverted it by inches in public, which is the only place inches matter. You cannot subtract violence from an age with a couplet, but you can sometimes subtract a blow. Notice, too, how the fool's half-freedom maps onto the half-freedoms that mark transitional eras. As literacy spread and cities swelled, pamphleteers, ballad mongers, and playwrights stepped onto the same precarious bridge. They learned the jester's tricks: allegory for safety, animal fables for deniability, the joke that can be defended as nonsense and remembered as sense. The stage adopted the cap and bells without the cap and bells. Clowns in Shakespeare who talk around a king's fault. Moralities that put vices in costumes and made them ridiculous before they were made illegal. Over centuries, the license migrated from a single body to genres, from bodies to pages and stages that could not be arrested as neatly as a man could. From here, the line to the present does not run straight, but it does run. Modern satirists, the late-night monologist, the editorial cartoonist, the writer who disguises a report as a joke so it can survive a feed, inherit the jester's equipment with battery power and cameras. They operate in a different legal weather, especially where constitutions formalize protections, but the social economy looks familiar. Proximity to power still matters. Audiences still perform allegiance by laughing or refusing. The logic of deniability still functions. Just kidding remains both a shield and, at times, a blade. In places where the law is friendlier to silence, comics and cartoonists and columnists discover the medieval truth again, that a punchline can be treated as a punch. Journalists, too, are cousins in this family of licensed discomfort. The best of them insist on facts the way a good fool insists on the plainness under the velvet. They lack bells, but their bylines make them visible. They lack the court, but their readers form a court everywhere. Where institutions hold, the press speaks more directly than jesters ever could, and suffers less immediately. Where institutions fray, reporters rediscover the old risk. Exile replaces banishment. Lawsuits replace floggings, smears replace stocks. In darker places, the medieval punishments reappear without the medieval poetry. The through line is not form, but function, to put unwelcome reality within reach of decision. The comparison has limits that are themselves instructive. A jester served a single body, the sovereign, and the sovereign's mood set the climate. Modern satirists and journalists serve publics whose moods are many and noisy. A king's frown could end a career. A crowd's click can amplify or erase a warning. The old court was small enough that a fool could read it like a face. The modern audience is too large for such intimacy, which is why the craft has shifted towards systems, editors, producers, platforms that distribute risk and sometimes sharpen it. And yet, the old questions persist with tonight's fonts. How close can critique stand without being declared treason? How much truth can a community bear at once? Who is allowed to speak it? And who pays when it lands badly? The medieval answer was tactile. A step nearer, a step back, a bell or none. The modern answer is procedural. Statutes, norms, libel law, algorithmic reach. But in both cases, the boundary is negotiated socially, in real time, with appetite and fear as the negotiators that never leave the room. If we bring the lens down again to Jacques, we can see his life as a footnote to a very large text about courage in calibrated doses. He is not a reformer. He is a translator between what a ruler prefers to hear and what a realm needs him to know. Translation is risky. If done too literally, it offends. If done too freely, it lies. The jester's art is to keep faith with the world while keeping the monarch's face intact. The political consequence lies not in any single quip, but in the habits produced over time. A monarch who has been teased into mercy once is easier to steer toward it again. A council that has laughed at its own pomposity finds it marginally harder to punish dissent as pure insolence. A people that has seen power blush learns to imagine it can blush again. There is a darker possibility, which honest history must admit. Humor can narcotize conscience. Courts have always hired entertainers to fill the air while hard decisions harden. A joke about taxes can convince a room it has addressed the matter when nothing has been altered but the temperature. A cutting song about war can become a fashion accessory for men who will vote for the next one. The jester knows this narcotic and tries, on his best nights, to lace it with a mild antidote, gentleness that asks for action, not just applause. But he also knows he is sometimes the anesthetic before the cut. So what, finally, did the cap and bells accomplish beyond diversion? They made a narrow, renewing corridor where truth and power could meet without immediately destroying each other. The corridor was policed by danger, maintained by craft, and constantly at risk of collapse. Whole cities now attempt to build such corridors with institutions and constitutions. When they succeed, the need for a single bellwerer diminishes. When they fail, the hunger for one returns, and so does the peril. On the last page of this perspective, picture a small exchange in a great hall. A king frowns. A fool bows. The room holds its breath. The line lands, balance between kindness and accuracy, and the frown relents by a degree. Nothing has changed. Everything has changed. That degree allows a minister to argue with less fear tomorrow. It allows a tax to be trimmed enough that a child keeps a winter coat. It allows the habit of hearing to grow a millimeter of muscle. The gesture is humble, provisional, endlessly repeatable. Centuries later, in a different architecture of power, press conferences instead of councils, screens instead of tapestries. The same transaction repeats. A joke lifts the lid on a concealed fact. A report confirms it. An audience laughs, then thinks. A decision shifts by a degree. We are tempted to call the jester obsolete because the tools have changed. But tools are least important in the dark. What matters then is the craft and the willingness to practice it at arm's length from danger. That is the historical legacy. Not the motley itself, but the discipline behind it. The practice of smuggling necessity past vanity, of placing a mirror where it can be glanced at without ceremony, of giving power away to choose the better version of itself without first having to admit it needs choosing. Jacques' bells are a sound from that older corridor. They say, "Here is a truth you can bear tonight. Here is a laugh that won't let you forget it in the morning. Here is the thin path between flattery and fury, walked carefully enough that others may cross after you." News of the defeat did not enter the hall. It settled there like weather. Steel was cleaned more carefully than usual. Bread broke with a sound too loud for soft loaves. The king's chair held a different stillness, as if the wood itself remembered being a tree and wished to be anywhere else. The banners that had ridden out bright came back with a tired bend, and the general's cloak owned too much mud to be mere fashion. No one spoke the name of the river where the day went bad, but everyone smelled it, silt and hoarse, and the metallic aftertaste of a hurry. The master of revels found Jacques in the shadow seam beside a tapestry and said the word that always meant there was no safe word. Cheer! Colin's old rule beat time in Jacques' ear. Throne, hearth, door. Tonight the door felt far as a coastline. He walked anyway, the bells agreeing to a single nervous syllable. The room watched him the way a falcon watches a field, intent, unsentimental. The chancellor's mouth waited in a shape that could become a smile or a trap. Agnes stood with a tray against her hip, her knuckles whitening, and then remembering to let go. The king's hands were motionless on the arms of the chair, the stillness of a man who had spent all his movement where movement mattered and found it not enough. Jacques led with softness, apple juggling deliberate enough to fail. A gentle fool's catechism to the marotte about the difference between courage and speed. Laughter came in teaspoons. He felt the court's appetite hunting the thing it had not yet named. The wish to be told that what happened on the river was either fate or lesson, not fault. He could feed them a pretty fate. He had it on his tongue. He swallowed it. Majesty, he said, and the word hung like a lantern on a storm hook. Where I was raised, we work beside a wheel that eats the river in slices. When the river runs wild, a wise man doesn't shout at the wheel. He listens for the river's mood, a murmur, safe, for now. He let the marotte nod, its little painted grin a witness that nothing here was meant to wound. But there's a trick, Jacques went on, and he felt the floor tilt, just slightly, toward the thrown distance. If a miller loves the sound of turning too much, he may open the sluice too wide. The wheel spins beautifully, faster than any in the valley, and then the grain, which is slower than pride, slides off the stones and into the water. He heard it happen, the first inward hiss as people understood the shape of the line. A young lord at the lower tables made the mistake of laughing too soon. The sound rang naked and died a quick death, feathers blown out of a pillow, and left a silence that rediscovered itself as a weapon. Jacques felt his back grow aware of itself. He could stop. He could smile, bow, turtle back into juggling. Let the room row to safer banks. He could also draw the point and live or die by the sharpness. He thought of the men at the river who would not be coming to any hall again, and of the women who would turn their jars and find no hands to help them lift. He thought of the mill's wheel and of the way it can only grind what is brought to it. He stepped once more toward the thrown distance. He turned the marotte so it faced the king, not as a challenge, but as a child's request. "Sire," he said, gentle as linen, "your banners fly faster than any in Christendom." Perhaps, only perhaps, tonight they outran the bread. The sentence was light as ash and heavier than iron. The hall inhaled and forgot how to exhale. Torches steadied themselves as if warned. Somewhere a dog put its chin on its paws in solidarity with every living thing that has ever wanted to undo the last heartbeat. Jacques could feel the idea race ahead of him into minds, each mind dressing it in its own fear. That he had accused the king of vanity, that he had called courage impatience, that he had stepped on the thin skin that covers a leader's private grief. The marotte's painted grin, faithful idiot, looked suddenly like blasphemy. The king's face did not change at first. Then it did, but not with heat. What came over it looked colder than anger, the kind of cold that sets after a burn. He lifted one hand, only a few inches, only enough to move a falcon from fist to air if a falcon had been there. And the motion passed through the room like winter through orchard. A chair leg somewhere made a coward sound against stone. The young lord who had laughed earlier made a show of drinking and found that nothing would go down. The chancellor's mouth closed on whatever shape it had been preparing to be. The general stared at the patterned rushes as if they could instruct him in a better memory. Colin, from a shadowed pillar, inclined his old red hood by a fraction. The smallest lighthouse, the kind that only warns the man who already knows the reef. Jacques' body discovered how many separate parts it had and offered to flee with each one. He kept them together by force of practice. He bowed, not the bow of surrender, or the bow of a man begging his neck to live, but the bow that admits an arrow has been shot and will travel where it must. "Explain," said the king. Not loudly, the low voice of a man who has stood in water to his thighs and counted the reasons not to drown. Jacques could hear the corridor to the door collapse into a thread. "Majesty," he answered, and the bells did not dare interrupt him. "Men will say anything at a fire. They will say the river was a traitor and the bridge a liar. They will say the wind conspired. I have only a miller's parable. If I have spoken it poorly, I am to blame for the poor speaking." He did not walk it back. He did not push it forward. He put it on the table the way a man puts down a cup that might hold medicine or poison and waits to see which. The king's eyes moved, left to the general, right to the chancellor, past them both to a place no one else could see. He had the look of a man parsing his own name. The silence held, and then began to hurt. A guard at the door adjusted the set of his feet. Agnes's tray, impossibly, did not shake. Somewhere behind a tapestry, a servant wept without sound, and the tapestry absorbed it the way walls learn to keep secrets. "Of old age," someone whispered at the far end, a story about Triboulet crawling like a rat out of a crack. The whisper died the death of things that arrive at the wrong hour. Jacques felt the weight of the bells, like a verdict that had not yet learned its wording. He thought of the hearth distance, and knew there was no bread warm enough in this building to soften what he had done. He thought of the door distance, and knew that even if the corridor recovered itself, he would never again mistake it for a promise. He thought finally of the throne distance and recognized the most honest thing about it, that it is measured in breaths, not in steps. The king lowered his raised hand to the arm of the chair, as if returning a sword to a scabbard. The gesture made no noise, and all the noise there is. In the same motion, he touched the rim of his goblet. Wine remembered how to be liquid. "Fool," he said, the word without contempt, without warmth. "You love mills. I, too, love wheels that feed people. I do not love being told they spin without grain." The room did not know whether this was the beginning of mercy or the preface to punishment. Jacques could feel the air, choose neither and both. He could also feel, from somewhere low in the braiding of his ribs, the plainest thing he had ever known rise to meet his mouth. "Then, sire," he said, softer than he had ever spoken in a hall, "let us fetch the grain." A thread snapped, or tied. It was impossible to tell in that heartbeat. The king's eyes flared, not with anger now, but with a brightness hard to name. His jaw set. The chancellor looked suddenly very interested in the floor. The general's shoulders rose, as if at last he had remembered how to breathe. The moment balanced, unnaturally, like a coin that has been spun too long and has chosen neither side. If a laugh had come, then honest, not ordered, it would have rolled the coin gently toward pardon. If a frown deepened by a hair, it would have clanged it down into punishment. No laugh came. No frown deepened. Only the hand of a king, resting on carved oak, and the cap of a fool, suddenly heavier than iron. The coin chose. It did not fall to steel. It rolled to exile. By morning, the decision wore its public close. A proclamation in steady clerk's hand. The fool, Jacques de Fleur, was spared for services rendered to the crown and sent, for a season of reflection, to the province of Valais, there to warm lesser halls and instruct the young in the arts of mirth. No hint of punishment inked the page, only honor's polite cousin, distance. The king signed without flourish. The wax cooled as if relieved. In the hall, the temperature learned the news before the people did. The chancellor's smile returned in its narrow version. He liked solutions that kept the furniture arranged. The general, passing Jacques in a corridor, paused long enough to make a bow that meant, "I have stood near danger too." Colin's old red hood appeared like a sunset at the edge of sight. "Door distance," he said softly, with pride that did not pretend to be joy. "You found it." He pressed into Jacques' palm a small knife with a blunt blade. "Kitchen steel, good for bread." "A tool," Colin said, "for gentler cuts." Agnès wrapped food as if packing a saint for travel. Bread, onions, a wedge of cheese that made a brave promise about the week ahead. She set down the bundle and looked at him, as if counting his ribs to be sure they were all still there. "You kept a thing alive last night," she said. "Now keep yourself." Her hands did not tremble, and because they did not, his did. The cap felt heavier that day, as if the bells had heard the word season and chosen to be winter. Jacques carried the marotte under his arm instead of letting it grin from his fist. He walked the stable yard once more, the dog circling him with the dignity of someone who had never needed a title to be important. The king did not summon him for farewell. That was right. Mercy keeps its distance to protect its own face. Out of the city, the road thinned. Towers gave way to roofs that knew the weight of thatch. The language of the land resumed its older grammar of weather and work. At inns, people asked if he was a player, and he said yes, because it was simpler than explaining that he had once juggled inches of policy. Children stared as children do, fearless with their eyes. The cap rang when the cart found a rut, and the bells sounded surprised to hear themselves among larks. Valet received him with a halfway welcome, the way a cold stream receives a hand. The bailiff's hall was honest timber and honest draught. Here the tapestries told fewer lies. Saints' faces were stitched by folk who had met hunger and meant their gold thread. Jacques' task was written on nothing: to make a stiff room bend a little at the waist, to teach a barren, sullen air that a joke can be kinder than a blow, to keep the feast nights from hardening into boast and quarrel. He was paid in coins, and in the small relief that visits a house when it remembers laughter has other uses. He did his work. He invented games that let men of equal anger lose to one another and leave with dignity. He praised the brewer's apprentice in front of the brewer, and thereby raised a wage without saying the word wage. He mimicked a taxman's walk just enough to make the taxman notice the floor creaked near the poor, and the floor creaked less the next month. He made the chapel boys giggle in the porch, and then, inside, taught them how to be quiet together. He learned the name of the river here, and stood beside it at dusk, listening for whether it sulked or sang. At times the past traveled faster than the post. Merchants brought rumors folded into bolts of cloth. The court had laughed again, at other things, with other men. A new wit glittered at the high table, lighter, safer, trained to prance within painted lines. Jacques felt the news, the way an old injury announces rain. He was not jealous so much as newly mortal. The bright corridor he had walked for a handful of years had closed behind him like water. The city would remember him, if it did, as a pause between jokes. He returned once to the mill of his childhood, a detour so small it could have been an accident. The wheel still turned. His father's beard knew more white. His mother's eyes had put away the habit of counting doorways for his return. They ate bread that tasted of the math of weather. He told them what could be told without sharpening fear. When he left, his mother replaced the old rosemary pouch with a newer one and pushed it into his palm with a quiet that said, "I do not trust kings to keep their promises, so keep this." He did not grow heroic in exile, only useful. Years moved with the patient gait of an ox. He carried his craft like a bucket to wells that needed it. When a winter hit harder than the map had scheduled, he staged a little play in which the Lord praised the village oven as if it were a cathedral. And the Lord, pleased with his reflected kindness, ordered the oven's woodpile fed from his own store. When a hot-headed cousin threatened to mend a quarrel with iron, Jacques let the Marat ask, in a silly voice, whether iron remembered anything except the last face it met. The cousin laughed, and did not forget the laugh when he counted his lives. And yet the truth remained. Laughter had saved him and cost him. The jest by the dais had given him the length of years. It had also erased a future measured in rooms that smell of beeswax and cinnamon in peril. He would not shape kings again. He would not walk the dangerous inch that moves a policy. The work ahead was smaller, and perhaps truer. Some nights that felt like loss. Some mornings it felt like choice. He kept the cap, though he wore it less. Bells are honest. They admit when a step is heavy. He held the Marat mostly for children, because children know how to let a toy be a tool. When he spoke of courts, if he spoke of them at all, he did not make himself grand. He said only that laughter is a key that fits many doors, and that if you turn it hard, you may break the lock, and if you never turn it, the room grows stale. Word drifted after a time that the king had ridden to that river again, slower, provisions laid with a clerk's patience, messengers listening to farmers the way princes listen to maps. Jacques did not claim a share in the change. He fed the rumor to his private hunger and let it go. Men deserve their own reasons, even kings. On a summer evening, when the light lingered as if uncertain of its duties, he sat with Agnès' last letter in his lap. She had married the cooper's widower and ruled 2 small boys with bread and firmness. "Sometimes," she wrote, "the hall laughs, and it is only air. Sometimes it laughs, and someone eats better. I think you taught me the difference." He read that line until the paper sighed. A passerby, seeing a man with a fool's cap, limp with years, might have called him a clown on holiday, a relic from a brighter room. Jacques did not correct them. The province had become his audience, not by design, but by survival. He had discovered that futures do not only run toward height, they can also spread quietly outward, like water leaving the mill race to green a field. Mercy had issued the sentence. Laughter had commuted it. Life had collected the fee. He walked the 3 distances still: throne, hearth, door. But their shapes had changed. The throne became a lord's bench, then a mother's worried chair. The hearth stayed the hearth. The door was now a path worn to the river, where he measured the day by the wheel's soft speech and let his bells, when he wore them, say only what was necessary and kind. There is a reason the fool wears bells. Not to announce himself, courts already know who has permission to be seen, but to remind the body that truth has weight and movement. Bells ask for balance. Turn too quickly and they speak. Bow too deeply and they speak. They tell on you when you tremble and when you dare. In that way, they are kin to conscience. Small, bright, audible even when a hall is loud, and impossible to silence without removing the very cap that makes you what you are. What is a jester when the feast ends and the torches sink into their own smoke? Not a toy, not a saint. Something else, the figure we place at the edge of power, so that power has a voice to answer when asked, "Can you bear yourself?" The fool becomes the question mark in a room of declarations. He is not righteous by default. He can be cowardly, vain, hungry for applause. And yet, his office, when practiced with care, is to bring the hard thing in a gentle cup, a parable instead of a charge, a mimicry instead of a denunciation, a laugh that loosens the fist on the table by a finger's width. Jacques de Fleur learned that craft until it became a way of walking. His life is smaller now. The grand corridors traded for roads that think about weather before politics. But the symbol remains intact. He is a sketch of a larger truth. In any age, someone must risk saying what is necessary in language that keeps listeners from shattering. That risk is never abolished by law or progress. It only changes its dress. Yesterday, it wore motley. Tonight, it wears headlines and monologues and memos that start with "for context." Tomorrow, it may wear something we have not thought to fear yet. The jester's paradox, half freedom, half noose, explains more than a career. It describes a condition of being human where authority exists. We all move between 3 distances. From us to the throne, courage. From us to the hearth, comfort. From us to the door, survival. Sometimes the throne is a literal sovereign. Sometimes it is a boardroom, a ministry, a comment section, a family table, when silence has become policy. Sometimes the hearth is the place that feeds us. Sometimes it is a handful of people who know our name without our mask. Sometimes the door is an exit, Sometimes it is a metaphor for not losing yourself. We travel those measures daily, bells or none. The fool's gift is to remind a ruler, any ruler, that listening is not the same as losing. He brings truth, wearing ribbon, so that it can be set on the table without breaking the service. That does not make truth smaller. It makes the table more stable. In the old halls, this craft kept tempers from burning the furniture. In our brighter rooms, it keeps institutions from turning stone-hearted. The price is visible. You may be welcomed one night and punished the next for the same sentence because appetite has moods. You may be asked to turn injustice into a clever object and then blamed for not turning it into a law. You may perform mercy and watch it be mistaken for entertainment. To accept the bells is to agree to these hazards. And yet, do not underestimate what a centimeter of room can do. A jest, well placed, is not policy, but it can be the wedge that opens a mind the width of a breath. A quip, honestly meant, is not reform, but it can teach a hand to pause before it signs. If you think such inches are too small to matter, ask any mason whether a wall stands or falls by them. The fear that surrounded Jacques is not medieval. It is perennial. The faces change. The furniture upgrades. The weather of politics becomes meteorology with graphs. But authority still reflexively mistrusts reminders that it is mortal and fallible. Communities still police their own speech, with laughter used as leash or lure. Crowds still punish in chorus what they would forgive one by one. The price of telling the inconvenient thing remains time. Time lost from status, time in the wilderness, time marked by the quiet work that follows after a door closes. The reward is also time, saved for someone else who will not be struck today because a room remembered itself. If the fool stands for anything enduring, it is for the possibility that gentleness can carry accuracy. This is not softness as surrender. It is softness as engineering, a calibrated give that keeps truth from snapping under load. The world knows how to deliver truth with a hammer. It frequently forgets how to deliver it with a hand that can also hold. Bells are for that. They make you aware of the edges you swing past, so that you move through crowded air without bruising what you mean to rescue. Consider the line that cost Jacques the court and bought him his life. It did not accuse, it invited. It was dangerous precisely because it made agreement easy. Tyranny prefers the clean comfort of enemies. It does not know what to do with a sentence that offers dignity while demanding responsibility. Mercy answered, but with distance. That, too, is a lesson. Laughter can keep the blade in its scabbard, but it cannot guarantee where you will be permitted to stand afterward. If you practice this craft, prepare to be thanked across a space you did not choose. Even so, there is peace to be found in the smaller radius. A village oven improved because a jest made generosity flattering. A quarrel cooled because ridicule, gently applied, let men save face. A taxman altered his route by a half-street because he preferred not to be a punchline again. These are not triumphs that historians underline, yet they are the seams that keep a society's cloth from fraying. The fool's late work, quiet, local, repeated, is the ethical patience of a man who has learned that fame is a mirror that fogs, and that usefulness is a lamp trimmed and kept. What does this say about us now? That our license to speak, when it exists, is strongest when it is shared. The more we build spaces where truth can arrive without first being disguised as jest, the less we require a single bell bearer to risk his neck for it. But when those spaces thin, when fear grows like ivy over the doors, we will look again for the figure who can cross a guarded threshold with a story and make a room hear itself. In some countries, that figure is a journalist with a stubborn notebook. In others, a comic with a camera and the patience to take a correction. In others, anonymous voices that join until anonymity becomes visibility. The costumes differ. The courage, in essence, does not. There is also warning here. Laughter can be narcotic. It can lull us into thinking that a problem addressed aloud is a problem addressed in fact. We must learn the difference, Agnes's difference, between air that feels good to breathe and air that carries bread smell because someone chose to bake. The jester can open the window. He cannot knead the dough. If we laugh and stop, we leave him to carry more than his share and congratulate ourselves for being enlightened while the room remains unchanged. Better to laugh than move, to adjust a policy, to call a friend back from an angry edge, to spend a coin where it warms more than the hand that gives it. As for fear, our old companion, it does not disappear when named. It stands up, stretches, and follows more politely. The jester's bells teach a way to walk with it so that it stops dictating direction. Step, sound, step. Admit the risk. Keep the tone human. If you must rebuke, hold the human fact in front of you like a lantern. If you must flatter, let it be the kind that flatters someone into being better than they planned. If you must retreat to the door to live another day, do it without poisoning the room you are leaving. You may need to enter it again when the weather shifts. And when you are very tired, when the night has arrived heavy, and your sentences feel like stones you have carried too far, remember that history's memory is longer than its headlines. The bells of a single cap cannot be heard across centuries, and yet somehow they are. They recur as a sensation more than a sound, a faint bright ring at the edge of stories in which power paused and listened, if only by instinct, a lingering shimmer in the air where someone once told the truth gently and someone stronger than him allowed it. That is why the image endures. Even when the names disappear, the tone remains. So picture, if you like, a hall long empty of its banners, tapestry faded to a thoughtful dusk, rushes cleaned away, stone keeping the cool it has always kept. Dust turns in a shaft of light and never quite lands. You would think the room had forgotten its voices, but press your palm to the dais stair. It holds the echo of steps. Stand where Jacques once weighed a line. There is a hush there unlike other hushes, as if the volume has been turned down in order to make room for something small. In that space, if you are very still, you may hear what the age before us swore it could not hear without violence. A quiet, persistent clarity that sounds, improbably, like bells. Not a clamor, not a summons to arms. A fine, metallic kindness that continues after the laughter fades. It rings in kitchens where generosity is negotiated, in councils where tempers remember their manners, in streets where strangers choose patience over performance. It rings in sentences that begin with, perhaps, and let us, and only this. It rings even in exile, where a man, no longer called to court, discovers that truth told softly in a smaller room can still keep a winter from being cruel. When the sound slips finally into memory, it does not leave the world empty. It leaves us with a craft. Walk your distances with care. Carry what must be said as if it were a bowl of water. Steady, no sloshing, no waste. Use laughter to open a door, not to hide behind it. Let your bells, whatever form they take, remind you that movement matters and that dignity is not an argument against honesty. And if, in some future dusk, you feel the old fear at your shoulder and the old choice at your feet, tilt your head just enough to wake the smallest chime. It will not make you safe. It will make you ready. That is the jester's bequest to those who come after him. Not a program, not a shield, but a way of sounding truth so that the era, startled into listening, can bear it. Long after the fools are gone and their voices dissolved into the stone, the bells keep their patient shimmer. The age leans in. The echo teaches. And somewhere, at a throne, a hearth, or a door, someone chooses more kindly because a small bright sound is still traveling through the air. In the end, the images return of their own accord, as if the story were leading us gently back through rooms we have already learned to walk. Torchlight that once danced now holds steady. The mill wheel turns, patient as breath. Somewhere a kitchen keeps its small republic of mercy, and the cap, set on a table for the night, remembers the tilt of a head that learned the weight of truth. Laughter has been both shadow and light here. It darkened when it hid cruelty, brightened when it saved a hand from striking, flickered when it trimmed pride by a hair, and let a room be kinder by an inch. It has been shield and mirror, comfort and caution, an opening in the wall, and, sometimes, a wall disguised as a window. If we have listened closely, we have heard its double voice, the quick one that warms a crowd, and the quieter one underneath that asks, almost shyly, "Now what will you do with the warmth?" The distances soften as we look back. Throne, hearth, door. No longer measures of danger, but familiar paths in a house we can leave without haste. Jacques' bells do not clamor, they offer time. Between their small notes, a natural pause widens, the kind that lets a hall remember itself. The banners are already still. The rushes no longer whisper under hurried feet. Even the marotte, laid down like a harmless joke that has done its work, seems to agree that this is enough. We allow the rhythm to slow, a breath between sentences, a space between images. The river that once outran the grain now keeps an honest pace beside it. The crown is only metal on a chair. The chair, only wood that will outlast any mood. What mattered, finally, was not the glitter of nearness, but the craft of carrying a necessary word without spilling it. That craft has walked with us to the edge of the hall and waits there, companionable, unafraid of quiet. If the age we visited felt severe, it also offered its instruction with unusual clarity. Courage that does not sneer, gentleness that does not lie, and a humor that knows when to bow out so attention can settle where it is needed. We take those with us. We leave behind the love of spectacle for spectacle's sake, and the habit of mistaking a laugh for a change. The bells, for their part, keep nothing. They simply ring, then rest. So this is our parting. Not a curtain dropped, but a light dimmed to dusk. The hall recedes into its stone. The kitchen breath cools. The path to the river is a ribbon of pale dust, patient underfoot. If you listen, there is no grand lesson marching away. Only the small, durable counsel this story has tried to practice. Walk softly with what is true. Let kindness be the handle of the mirror. Measure your steps. And if, on some evening when the day has put away its clamor, you catch the faintest tremor in the air, a silver suggestion more felt than heard, trust that recognition. It is the tone that lingers after good laughter, the remnant of a craft that kept rooms human. And if, in some evening quiet, you hear a faint chiming, perhaps it's only the echo of a medieval jester's bells, reminding us laughter always has a price.